Dr. Anthony Manning is Dean of Global and Lifelong Learning at the University of Kent. Anthony, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you today. Could you just start by telling us a bit about yourself, please?
Great. Yes, thank you for having me. Yes, my role is Dean for Global and Lifelong Learning at the University of Kent. But throughout my career, I've been involved with English language teaching. Firstly, I began as a teacher of French and German, but later moved into English language teaching, and I worked in France, Germany, China, and Japan in various different ways, and then came back into the UK higher education system. And since then, I've been working in English for academic purposes and leading teams that are focused on international programs, support of international students. And latterly, I've also branched out into work-based learning, focusing on degree apprenticeships. But my heart is very much with international education and still in the area of English language teaching. And recently I had the pleasure of joining the British Council as part of their English language advisory group, which was also great.
What was it that drew you to international education in the first place?
Sure. So, I mean, I originally come from the Isle of Man, and my family is not particularly internationally experienced. And so for me, it was during my secondary school experience when I really became interested in all things international through the learning of languages, because I discovered that one of the things I was good at was language learning. And so that drew me through French and German into interest in other cultures. And later, when I realized that I didn't really choose French and German, it was just that French and German were the languages in my school, that I could use my English language skills to travel further afield and also to help other people across the world learning English, given the importance of English as a global language.
And has your experience as an ESL teacher, English as a second language teacher, which is how you started off, has that changed the way you communicate in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it always helps me think about how what I'm saying is being received, I suppose, in terms of the way in which we should frame our speech and communication in order to achieve positive communication outcomes. Because at the end of the day, yes, accuracy is important, but what we want to be able to do is have meaningful exchanges, understand each other and learn from each other. So um, being in the classroom teaches you, I think that, if you say things in one way, or if you present something or a learning point in a particular fashion, and it isn't immediately understood or engaged with appropriately, then there are a range of ways in which you can modify what you're doing so that people have another chance to understand, or a different means of engagement. And for me, that's in a way a metaphor for communication and interaction more generally, in terms of trying to tailor what we deliver or co-create with students so that it's adjusted according to their needs and their ultimate kind of targets, including employability beyond study.
So it's the ability to adapt your language to facilitate meaningful communication that you've
Yeah.
taken from your ESL career. Is that something that, in your experience, comes naturally to people, or is it actually a skill or set of skills that has to be learned?
I think it's definitely something that needs to be learned, but perhaps there are particular personalities that are already more attuned to that way of thinking. I think going back to my roots and my family, I came from quite a big family that was full of children in different, quite nearby locations in the Isle of Man, but we were always moving between each other's houses and talking to each other and trying to, communicate in different ways and navigate, life in that way. And I think if you're in that kind of space where you're doing that and you're actively trying to kind of negotiate and mix with people in any culture, even your own culture, that's a good kind of foundation for understanding how different people learn in different ways and how material should be tailored according to different purposes, which is why, in a way, I think, moving more specifically into English for academic purposes was interesting for me because it was also that challenge of trying to work with people with multiple disciplines in the same classroom, limited resources. So the ideal of being able to give everybody exactly what they need is not possible necessarily, although there are still ways of trying to get closer to that, or as close as you can, to try and help people by differentiating, the tasks you give them or the outcomes you expect from them in different ways.
So when we think about higher education and meaningful exchanges with and between students, when we think about international students who speak English as a second language, what are some of the main challenges that they face in UK higher education in terms of communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges that international students face are many and kind of multifarious based on their different cultural backgrounds, the languages they speak, and how close or different they are to English, as well as the experience they might have had of other cultures or institutions before. But I do think, within the UK system, UK students, whilst many are very welcoming, we're not that well prepared potentially, in terms of how we deal with people who aren't able to speak, in the same way that native speakers speak, although obviously native speakers speak in a broad range of ways as well. So I think international students might come with an expectation of, engagement being easier, and internet and home students will come with, um, in many cases, an ambition to mix quite broadly, and yet something in the middle is potentially missing in terms of understanding the cultural expectations on both sides so that that engagement happens optimally. And that is something which has led me to one of my great current passions, which is internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I know this has been a big project that you've been working on and collaborating on for quite some time. So internationalisation at home, just give us an overview of what that is and what you've been doing.
Sure. Well, if we start with study abroad, which is something different to internationalization at home, but study abroad is obviously a massively influential and important activity for those of us who are able to engage with it. And as we said at the beginning, you and I both benefited from having experiences of living abroad, and those immersive experiences can really trigger strong reactions and important changes in thinking processes, which might have a lasting impact on us in all sorts of ways, helping us to understand what we like about our own cultures as well as what we like about other cultures that we're experiencing. So I'm a great proponent of that. But as we see from statistics at the moment, probably something like only 1 or 2% of UK students get the opportunity to study abroad. So whilst we want that number to go up, which has declined since Brexit and COVID, we probably can't afford to put all of our eggs in the study abroad basket, and therefore internationalization at home is an approach which looks at how we can enhance the international experience of everybody on our campuses or in our institutions to try to create connections which enable on-campus activities, networking, communication opportunities, festivals, intercultural learning, cultural intelligence development, all sorts of those things, including things like learning other languages or doing things in the classroom as well as outside the classroom in the informal curriculum, which in a way maximizes the potential of bringing people together. Because I think what we can see is that access is one step. So access in terms of having a range of different UK students and international students in our universities is one thing, but encouraging engagement between those groups takes a little bit more effort. And I think it's worthwhile to have that effort for the greater good of what you might call knowledge diplomacy, in terms of how people come together and solve problems and create solutions that are more transferable around the world. As well as, if we bring it down to the nuts and bolts of institutional competitivity, how we properly demonstrate as institutions that we are investing in creating a curriculum that really is designed for an international audience.
So it's to the benefit of many stakeholders, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So home students and international students.
Yeah.
And from what you're saying, it seems to affect potentially quite a broad range of university
Yeah.
activities. So we're talking about the formal curriculum, the hidden curriculum, if you like,
Yeah.
and many types of interactions between staff and students.
Yeah, absolutely. So no matter what sector you're in, if you're working in education, one good resource is this resource I've been lucky enough to collaborate on through Universities UK International, the handbook for internationalization at home, and it comes with an infographic as well. And it shows you all the different exercises and activities that could be comprised within those different spheres of the formal curriculum, the informal curriculum, and the hidden curriculum, which is essentially the policies and services and procedures that kind of bring a certain culture to your provision. And yes, we can see there are all sorts of stakeholders involved in that. It could be people doing the teaching, it could be people providing support, it can be alumni, it could be local members of the community. So it's a really broad opportunity. And I think also focusing on how you systematize some of that activity and make students more aware of how they can engage with it as a system as a whole is really valuable, because sometimes we can create multiple initiatives that we can see coherence in that students can't necessarily see the same coherence in because they're bombarded with too much information.
And going back to your point about trying to create a genuinely welcoming environment, because what you were saying with that slightly earlier on was that the motivation, I think, to be welcoming and to include and to be engaging with all students is definitely there
Yeah.
from different groups of students without othering people and staff. But sometimes just not always possible for various reasons, perhaps a skills gap to implement in practice. So something like the Internationalisation at Home handbook, which
Yeah.
gives practical ways of doing that, is
And what most institutions will find is that when they start the process of reviewing what they already have with the guidance of a tool like that, you'll see that you have many structures already that fall into that category. And looking at it more systematically can just show you where the gaps are. So if you're running, if you are focused on the world of English language teaching in one way or another, then this is obviously a key point in engaging students with how they can communicate effectively. It can be how you bring in guest contributions into your classroom through collaborative online international learning, maybe just beaming someone in through Teams or Zoom. It could be how you celebrate festivals or how you engage members of the public with international groups in your classes or through project work. So there are all sorts of different avenues, and that's really what I encourage people to do, because I, as well as working through my team of English language teachers, I also work with other disciplines, and it's definitely the case that you need to tailor what you're doing according to the resources available, but also the kind of culture of the subject area, which allows different mechanisms to engage.
And in terms of engagement, your background is very interesting because you were saying that you became interested in international experiences through learning second languages. I think you said French and German, didn't
Yeah.
you, when you were at school, and that led you to work in English language teaching and communication and be able to travel. But of course, now we're seeing that learning a second language in schools is something that's very, very much decreasing as fewer people either choose to take foreign languages or have them available to take. Do you think that has had an impact? I'm thinking particularly about home students. Does that have an impact, you think, on their general ability to communicate successfully in an international setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most powerful outcome of language learning is not necessarily becoming proficient in a language at the end of it, because we know historically, don't we, that although in the past more people study languages than they do now. We're not famous as a nation for creating huge volumes of highly proficient other language speakers, but the process of finding yourself in that challenging circumstance where you're trying to communicate and you're trying to do that in another culture through another language helps you reflect on the core dimensions of the communication act that you're engaging with. And I suppose the raw humanity of the needs you're trying to address, either those needs that you have or the support you're trying to provide with other people. So for me, one of my work abroad experiences was in China. So in 1995, went to China with voluntary services overseas. And at the time, I think I was one of two non-Chinese people in my town of 250,000. And that for me was the kind of archetypal culture shock experience where I was deep-ended and really, thought deep and hard about my own culture and what I missed and what I didn't miss, as well as what I found so exciting about being in China, along with some of the things that were more challenging. And through that process, some of the things you take with you and you incorporate into your global citizenship, I suppose, and some of the things you kind of tuck behind your ear as things that you're aware of from other cultures that maybe you don't want to take with you. And as a whole, I think that informative process is really powerful in terms of international relations more generally. So I can speak some Mandarin, but the most powerful impact for me on that was, really getting my head under the bonnet about how other people think and work and how people react to different situations. And that I think is powerful in the workplace in terms of, working with people in the immediate proximity of your work face to face or online, because increasingly people will be collaborating in teams online with teams that they may never meet. And whilst English is likely to remain a global language or lingua franca in that context, those experiences of missing cues or not quite understanding or fathoming what somebody was trying to say the first time for whatever reason is a real learning experience that helps us empathize and navigate and support each other, I think, internationally.
No, I definitely agree with what you're saying. And as you were talking there about your experiences of working in China, it reminded me of many, many years ago, living and working in South Africa and having to try and communicate in Xhosa as a language similar to Zulu. And when I went there initially, I could not speak a word of that language. And it was the first time, despite having traveled internationally before, that I'd been unable to communicate.
Yeah,
Because everywhere else I went, English was sufficient for sort of my basic communicative needs. And suddenly I couldn't express myself at all. And that was very, very humbling, although expected. What I found more challenging and more humbling was when I became quite a bit more proficient in that language and I could actually communicate to a reasonable degree. And I thought I'd done very well. I'd learned an awful lot and I was a successful communicator. And yet, still, despite knowing the language, if you like, and being able to use it at least to a certain level, there was so much that I missed. And there were so many times when I wish people would slow down or simplify or adjust their language for me,
yeah,
which in a way, in that context, is almost slightly arrogant because you're in maybe a community meeting with 40, 50 people. Um, and you don't really have the right to stand up, particularly as the only white person in that room, in that culture, and say, can you all slow down and change your language? But in a way, that's what I needed. And for me, as a native English speaker, I think that's never left me,
yeah,
um, because I see a lot of international students coming to the UK, either to a language school or to a university, various universities, and their English is actually pretty good and they've got a good enough IELTS score.
yeah.
And yet, the way that we use English here
Oh,
is
yes,
not quite the
absolutely.
same as the type of world English that they've learnt. And
Yeah.
unless you're in the TESOL world, you may not immediately appreciate that. And so it really does make me think of the need to adjust and accommodate in communication in particular. You're talking about working with people across disciplines and with limited resources. And I'm thinking about the set pieces of academic communication with students, so lectures and seminars and tutorials.
Yeah.
What can lecturers do, in your view, to make communication more accessible to international students who speak English as a second language?
Sure. Well, I think there are a range of things. I think sometimes actually the ways in which people think they're making their language more accessible actually has the opposite effect. I think I've been in a number of lectures with international students over the years where particularly anecdotes cause trouble because you can see a UK lecturer trying to engage a group of students with maybe a predominant UK group by referring to popular culture or some aspect of life that is not necessarily immediately obvious to an international audience, or it could have a kind of historical implication, or something from the newspaper or the television, which they're not able to grasp in the same way. I think certainly lecture capture and transcription these days is useful in terms of people being able to review what they have listened to. But of course, I would still advocate for attending in person, given that there's nothing quite like being in the room in terms of hearing it firsthand and finding out what you understand and what you don't understand the first time, and then using that recording as a mechanism to fill in the gaps, if you like. And also being there in person has the opportunity to create opportunities for engagement with students that might spill out of the formal environment. Certainly small group activities, so seminars and the preparedness in advance of those activities, where students are able to stimulate their schemata in advance, if you like, through understanding, having more time to prepare what they're going to say and engage with the topic rather than it being spontaneous, which is probably more reflective of the real world. And also opportunities to speak and do group work and think of, I suppose, international mechanisms for assessment, or engaging with other students that are beyond the usual repertoire. So I've seen good examples of viva voce examinations being used, oral examinations being used over essays sometimes, which appeals to certain demographics, and shorter answer questions potentially to demonstrate knowledge, but not necessarily complicate knowledge demonstration through essay technique, and other ways of building in internationalized learning outcomes into modules that encourage collaborative working with people beyond maybe comfort zones or UK or monolingual, monocultural groups. I think all those things can help.
So there's the avoidance of culturally specific references which may not be accessible to all international students. So avoiding anecdotes, as you were saying. I like the point you made in particular about group work and exercising your schemata. So giving people, just in language terms, giving people a chance to think through and even rehearse what they're going to say.
Yeah.
Before reporting back, feeding back to the entire seminar cohort, can be very useful. And your point about assessment, there's a wider point here. So you're talking about assessments which are internationally appropriate, and focus on the knowledge and assessing that rather than assessing the demonstration of knowledge. Which is a slightly different thing. Is there, and this is I'm asking for a generalization here, you may not be able to give it, it may not even be right, but is there potentially a tendency to focus too much or even unfairly on language use in assignments rather than the quality of thought or the critical analysis that's gone into it.
Yeah. And I think we can see a cultural difference in different disciplines in how um, the accuracy or the way in which language is used. Um, Obviously, we need to have a base level minimum, as we can see through many assessments that are gatekeeping functions to get into different institutions. But we can also within institutions see different levels of tolerance in terms of accuracy. Traditionally, in some of the science subjects, we can see a kind of greater focus on, as I said earlier, the demonstration of knowledge and less concern over precision in language, which is controversial, I think, still for many linguists and potentially practitioners in those disciplines or academics in those disciplines. But obviously, again, in the real world, we work with people with a range of different levels of ability in language and a range of different levels of ability in the skills that they have acquired. And we can see, can't we, that, you know, people are able to balance and offset deficits in particular skills or strengths and weaknesses in different skills with other strong skills that they have. I mean, we may have somebody who's, you know, highly proficient in memorizing something, but who is, you know, finds uncertainty very difficult to manage with, and therefore the lack of tangibility in a project may mean that it interferes with their ability to use the knowledge that they've acquired, whereas other people who are kind of enthused or excited by the flexibility of the project are able to bring in their more limited knowledge and bring it to the fore and help make the project shine sufficiently. And similarly with language, if we have other communication skills, if our personality and or approach is such that we are engaging, if our determination is there, then potentially there are ways of communicating beyond the quest for perfect, you know, linguistic precision. So I think that's the reality of it. And it's also, in a way, linked to authentic assessment, which we can see being referred to more, which is thinking deeply about whether the way in which whatever you're trying to assess is being assessed is actually reflective of the way in which people will have to use that knowledge or demonstrate that skill in the future. And often we can see that the methodology for that is not closely linked to the reality. So I think further work to be done on that in all sorts of ways.
And you're talking about the way people operate in the real world at the beginning of your answer, and you referred to a variety of skills and skill types
Yeah.
that people will have to engage with when they're working in teams and working
Yes.
internationally. And the thing that was in my mind as you were saying that was, in addition to that, there's also a variety of English.
Of course. Yeah.
The regional varieties of perfectly legitimate forms of
Yeah.
English. And we're not talking about pidgin English or inadequate English or slang, but
No.
different standards, if you like, which are actually accepted in many,
Yes.
many other countries where they are spoken and written.
Yeah. And we
So,
only have to look within the UK to see the variety of dialects to demonstrate that there is no single English, even in our own backyard, let alone across the world. And we engage fluidly with people who use language in different ways from within our own country. You know, dialectal changes in the use of grammar or in the use of certain forms of lexis, and so it's the microcosm of the wider world. And whilst we sometimes perceive ourselves to be in the middle of something that we consider to be a superior version of the language, we obviously need to realize we're just one strand, and that the kind of beauty in the way in which we can engage with one another comes from the varied tones and forms of language that we can use to communicate, and from which we can learn a lot from one another still in all so many ways, given that language in different regions, whether they are the counties of the UK or the countries of the world, has developed in different ways to mold and flex to the needs of the locality in which it's used.
yeah. And clearly we need to have, I'm just thinking generally, we need to have some standard so that we can communicate. And
Yeah,
we communicate as individuals with no common reference.
yeah, absolutely.
Communication breaks down. It doesn't necessarily mean that the way that one group does it is the best, and certainly not the only way in which we can do it.
Yeah,
And we've seen that there are, I think, just some major problems with the approach of almost trying to impose, perhaps inadvertently, one standard form of English. I was thinking of I think it was the PLOS Journal article, which found that non-native speakers have to work so much harder to
yeah,
get published in academic journals. And again, we're
absolutely.
not talking about people here with pidgin English
No,
or
no.
limited knowledge. These are postdocs, often who've been in higher education and research for many years. And yet, because the form of English they're using is different to this particular norm, papers are being rejected.
Yeah,
And again, this isn't one academic journal that's rejecting them. This seems to be across the
sure.
board, particularly within science. And the argument goes that particularly the global south is suffering from the inability to get papers published. And then everyone suffers because sharing of knowledge goes down. So the implications of this are actually quite big, whichever,
Absolutely.
whether you agree or not with some of the propositions that people are making. Is this discussion about language use, language form, language variations, is this something that is really happening within staff at universities? I mean, you mentioned assessments and ways we can reflect on our practice there, but is it something that really is an ongoing thought or an ongoing policy? You know, when you got a tutor from, I don't know, humanities, they've got 40 assignments to mark in 10 working
Yeah.
days at the end of term, a research paper to write, and everything else that's going on in their life as well. Are they actually conscious of variations in language use and how they should mark that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a constantly iterative process because obviously, as you say, the people who are overseeing different activities or assessments or teaching are kind of quite frequently changing. But also, we can see that also universities, despite the challenges of things like Brexit, are still comprised of highly internationalized staff. And therefore, yes, I would definitely say that the understanding of the need for a broader acceptance of a range of Englishes is there in terms of what is considered acceptable or sufficiently, intelligible to be communicative and suitable as a form of English for academic purposes, which is again no one thing. And as I said, the kind of idiosyncrasies as to what is important in different academic genre linked to specific subject areas changes quite significantly. So there are, I think, accepted tolerances in certain subject areas that would not be acceptable in other subject areas, probably for good reasons, given the focus on the information being exchanged or the mechanism through which it is being provided or the level through which argumentation is essential. So I think all those things are happening, and also through the interaction between teachers of English for academic purposes and academics, we can see, I think, that having a positive influence in both directions in terms of understanding what is important to academics and also having that acceptance or tolerance of a broader range of Englishes. Yeah.
That's interesting. I was looking at the abstract of some of your papers from a few years ago when you
Yeah.
were looking at the place of English for academic purposes
Yeah.
tutors within the context of higher
Yeah.
education. And I think one of the things you were saying was that in certain cases, we can't overgeneralize, but in certain cases, there can be a bit of a power distance between EAP tutors and the EAP department, and subject tutors, which can prevent information exchange and an
Yeah.
improvement of best practices. I think this paper, I think you wrote it in 2009, so I
Yeah.
accepted it is some time ago.
Sure.
Is that still potentially the case? And if so, what can be done about that?
Yeah. I think it's dependent on a range of things. I think what you're referring to is an academic called, I think it was Reimer, who described the butler's stance,
Mm.
where teachers of English for academic purposes have referred to feeling subordinated in the relationship with interaction with academics. And I think there are still cases where that happens, but it is also partly about, I think, the level of maturity of the language centre within the or the the department within the university that provides English for academic purposes or pre-sessional courses. It's the level of maturity of that department. It is also the kind of embedded strategy that those colleagues or the leaders of those departments have in terms of encouraging meaningful interaction between academics and English for academic purposes tutors, or they, in some cases, they are, contracted on the same kind of contracts, which I'm very much in favour of, given that these colleagues are actively involved in scholarly activity and teaching in a way that is not dissimilar to academics who are focused on teaching other subject areas. So that is an iterative process where um, obviously people deserve, in whatever profession, deserve to be treated with respect and the right kind of manner within any institution. But it's about demonstrating, how you understand the challenge ahead and how you can be useful and supportive and interactive in that space. So certainly within my own institution, I've seen that develop over the years, but it is something that um, needs ongoing focus, given that at times of resourcing challenge, there can be a push-pull factor between what's perceived to be professional services and what's perceived to be academic provision, and where the responsibility lies for what. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just interesting. And the other thing I've noticed working with universities, I think that there's a tendency for there to be data silos,
Yeah.
which is such a shame people can't overcome them. So I've been working, for example, with a careers department at a
Yeah.
university, looking at communication with international students, so helping the staff improve the way they communicate. But they also want to be helping the students communicate better if they're writing CVs
Yeah.
or they're writing job applications or whatever. I can't name the university, but one of the great sad things about this is there's no real connection between the career service and the English language department in terms of the students' needs.
Mm.
So you have careers advisors who see students coming in and they need to be able to structure their CVs differently.
Yeah.
The careers advisors really haven't got the time or even perhaps the knowledge to be able to do that. The English Language Centre does, but there's no meaningful way for
Yeah.
those two departments to communicate. And so the English Language Centre is still churning out students who can't write CVs, to put it simply. And you've got the careers service trying to put that right, but without the skills. And if only they could send samples of writing across
Yeah.
anonymized and say, this is what we're getting, do a needs analysis, identify the common points that need to be
Yeah.
changed, and build that into your teaching, you could save a lot of problems occurring. And I
Oh,
suspect
absolutely. I
this
mean,
is a general issue with universities.
it's a great shared project, isn't it, with overlapping aims and solutions. So, um, I mean, in a way, there's unlikely to be anything in the way between the leaders of those two departments deciding to collaborate with each other. But of course, again, there are all sorts of areas that you might choose to collaborate in. But you'd hope that they'd be able to see where the overlap is and in time identify a mechanism to collaborate. I mean, just in my context, it's we've been working with the University of Nairobi, for example, in Kenya, because we identified the need for shared learning from each other because of what our Kenyan students were telling us about the challenges of employability when they return home. So we've been working with them to develop new structures for careers advisory that could be localized in Kenya. And we've then been learning from Kenyan careers advisors about how we can modify what we do in the UK to support international students better. And some of that is also around language use.
You mentioned the need and the desire to create a welcoming environment for international students from all people involved. What advice would you give to home students about communicating clearly with international students who speak English as a second language, particularly given the context, as we were saying earlier on, that many home students will possibly not have studied a foreign language at school. So this style of communication is going to be very new to them. What would you
Yeah.
say to them to help them communicate successfully?
I suppose my biggest advice would be to try and try and try again, because I think probably the reason why um, some UK students don't have successful experiences of communicating with international students is because perhaps a form of interaction that they have engaged has not been received in the way that they expected it to, and that has had an impact on their confidence to do it again. Not because something terrible was said, because that's highly unlikely, but perhaps there was a kind of leap of faith to communicate with someone and that person didn't understand or perhaps misinterpreted what was said, and therefore that person doesn't, the UK person perhaps doesn't want to do it again because they don't want to cause offense to the person that they were trying to speak to, and they also, don't want to feel embarrassed about having a failed form of communication. I'm being very general, obviously, because there are many circumstances where UK and home students interact very successfully, and there are lots of stories of how friendships and relationships have been enduring and continued way beyond university life. But for those who have found it kind of stressful or have had a problem with an interaction, I would just say try again, because um, it will be so well received, and the process of trying and engaging with people from other cultures, as we've discussed today, is so rewarding and important for our personal development and also for our understanding of the wider world and the world of employability in terms of how we engage broadly in context where it's not an option whether we need to or not, where we're told we have to engage internationally potentially. It would be good to have experience of having navigated that and kind of positively before circumstances where it might be higher stakes, where you've not taken the opportunity to get the experience that you could have done. And at the end of the day, I think we've said so clearly, and the listeners who are tuning in, I'm sure will feel the same, given that they're likely to be from similar backgrounds. It's such a rewarding experience to learn from people who speak other languages and to try to, learn another language or experience another culture creates a new form of yourself that you may have never seen before, and allows you to kind of think about the world in different ways that can be challenging and exciting in ways you've never expected.
And that's such a positive note on which to end this podcast, Anthony. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thank you very
You
much.
too. Thank
And
you for having me.
thank you.